for people with disabilities. Swabhiman has demonstrated strong leadership and expertise in addressing disability from the rights, development, and inclusion perspective. It has actively engaged with NGOs and DPOs from across the state of Orissa and the country, and has brought about several policy changes. Swabhiman works at the international level with the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum and the DPI, the Disabled People's International India chapter. Since the past 19 years, Swabhiman organizes a children's festival, Anjali, bringing together children with disabilities and without for an inclusive camp in the capital for a couple of days. This is Anjali's 20th year. Anjali has grown to become the only children's international festival of the country, overcoming challenges and creating milestones. Starting with just 77 local children, it has reached to about 50,000 children from across 30 districts in Orissa, 25 states in India, and 7 countries. To create an understanding of the issues around disability and the impact of an inclusive society, as well as the necessity of development, Swabhiman has conceptualized Dialogues in Disability. Today's session deals with the topic of COVID-19 response and the disabled in Commonwealth countries. This dialogue will focus on the experiences of people with disabilities and the challenges faced by them during the devastating waves of COVID-19. The panel discussion will explore both the gaps and the good practices in disaster management systems, as well as the policies and potential for collaborative efforts between government, civil society, and people with disabilities. Today, we have an esteemed panel comprising of Richard Reiser, Dr. Komal Kamra, Mr. Mihir Mohanty, Prasanna Kurupu, Abia Akram, Emily Gauss, and Dr. Shruti Mahapatra. Now, I would like to invite Madam Tanmay Sahu and Madam Swati Shri Maharana from Team Swabhiman to tell us a little bit about this beautiful festival that we have been organizing for the past 19 years.
Thank you so much, Beauty. A very good evening to everyone and welcome to the 20th edition of Anjali Festivals. As you know that the pandemic has taken a lot from us and we are back with even more better, more collaborative and even more stronger. So today we have with us a group of panelists from India, UK, Sri Lanka, South Africa. So before we start it, I would like to request our program manager, Mrs. Tanmay Sahu, to speak a few words about Anjali Festivals.
Good evening, Namaste from India. I am Tanmay. I will tell you in brief about Anjali Festival. Anjali started as a very miniature form in the year 2001. Anjali was started to showcase the potentialities and the good qualities of children with disabilities, but it evolved to be an inclusive and joyful platform for all. Much before India thought of inclusive education, Swabhiman implemented Anjali Festival for children with disabilities, taking into consideration the inclusive aspect. So, initially, Anjali started with 77 participants and as a local festival, but now we have become an international festival. Initially, Anjali started with taking only disabled children, and then soon after, children with non-disabilities also enter. Then enter the teams of India. Then in 2004, Anjali International Children Festival was only a national festival. And in 2011, Anjali Festival became international with participants from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So it's a long and rich journey of 20 years from 77 participants to near about 40,000 participants from all across the state of Odisha, from all across the 25 states of India and 7 countries worldwide. So maybe the COVID-19 pandemic has stopped us from conducting a physical festival for all, but it didn't stop our energy and enthusiasm. We continued it virtually, and here we are with all of our esteemed juries for this panel discussion. So this is about Anjali. Over to Deepti to join our panelists, esteemed panelists for the panel discussion.
Yes, thank you, Madam Tanmay and Madam Swatishri. Now I would like to introduce Mr. Raja Mishra. Mr. Mishra is a tech enthusiast, an entrepreneur, a writer, and a public speaker. Mr. Mishra has worked for the IT industry for almost 7 years before moving to Odisha to start his company, which is mostly geared towards empowering people with disabilities through technology. I would ask Mr. Mishra to now introduce the dialogues in disability and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Siti. Hello, everybody. This is Raja Mishra. So let's start with a very interesting saying by the Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg. He once told that the single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is a virus. In the year 2020, a pandemic struck. In 2021, we began fighting back against an invisible enemy. Dialogue in disability perhaps is the most constructive way to take the fight back to an enemy which we can't see. There's a lot to reflect as to what was done, what should have been done, and what can be done in the future. There's a very interesting saying in the Hindu mythology, Sagar Manthan, which basically means churning of the sea that essentially created the world as we know it. And that basically brings us to the next step, that is discussion. Changes bring a lot of good things, and these changes are brought by deliberations, a lot of brainstorming, and a lot of discussion. So let's start. In civic societies like ours, changes come through discussions. Solutions are the results when stakeholders from various walks of the society and from various parts of the world with vast human experiences come together to brainstorm and propose improvements to the living conditions of the vulnerable most through pertinent dialogue and constructive actions. Challenges like the pandemic do not just test the resolve of the individuals at an individual level, but also effectively verify the capability of various mechanisms or machineries of administration as well as society. Provided that the differently able communities are the most neglected in the larger scheme of things, it is imperative that the dialogues happen more often on the topics covering their interests, just so that the real inclusion truly happens. In the worst of the chaos, it is rather easy to forget the forgotten. Questions like what people with disabilities go through physically, emotionally, sexually, education-wise, and professionally are lost in the mayhem. Somehow, the priorities are very different. Added to that, the fact that most differently able have compromised immune systems or are on medications, thus have specific needs which are not fulfilled when the whole world is on lockdown or in lockdown, have been the realities which have surfaced across the globe in different pockets during this pandemic. These also are the best time for the world to learn the art of resilience from the most undaunted of the people. The pandemic perhaps was the litmus test for many things, from verifying our attentiveness, our carefulness, the time we take to react to a crisis, our resolve to fight back against an invisible enemy, our priorities, and our social responsibilities. COVID-19 witnessed human resolve in its purest form. Something that made us come this far, defying all the odds to win the championship of evolution, was tested with this pandemic. But it also exposed the underpreparedness of the system to accommodate the reasonable needs of differently abled. Developed, developing, underdeveloped, all nations were brought to their knees by this disease. And in all this chaos, somehow the urgent attention of the health and well-being of people with disabilities were lost in some places. Social stigma only made things much worse for many. Being part of the Commonwealth, however, gives us access to shared manpower, shared ideas, and various kinds of solutions. This is one group which has nations at different stages of development. Thus, their problems are diverse and solutions very, very creative. Through deliberations like these, we will be able to harness our collective potentials and be better prepared for the future. Vaccinations and spatial hospitals for the differently able, for instance, are essential facilities that better accommodate treatments and recovery of the said group in a much more controlled manner. After all, we are striving with the notion of development, of a better world, of a better future, and of course, better experience. Bottom line is that once disability really teaches one the art of being strong and staying that way when chips are down. So most of us did. It was much more difficult for us, yeah. But yeah, that's the point. We are the best of the survivors. We survive to tell our stories, suggest changes through personal experiences, and make this world a better place. For the longest period of time, differently abled have been the changes that they hope to see in the world, and it is the dialogues like these, discussions and deliberations, and various ideas that come out of these discussions, where talents from all walks of the society, from all across the globe, come together to propose solutions to universal issues that really bring about the changes. This pandemic is not over yet. This may not be the last pandemic either. So we truly have a long way to go in refining the medical system and the accessibility spectrum to better accommodate the differently abled.
Raja, we have to stop here.
Right.
So thank you, Mr. Mishra, for that beautiful introduction. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Madam Smita Sadasivan. Madam is a self-advocate for cross-disability rights in India. She has been working for the advancement of human rights of people with disabilities at the national level for the past 17 years. Apart from being the accessibility consultant for the Election Commission of India, she carries out different roles, including that of the regional trainer for South Asia Women's Institute on Leadership and Disability Program at the Mobility International USA, and is a member of the National Committee for the Rights of People with Disabilities, facilitated by the NCP-EDP New Delhi. Now I'd like to invite Madam Smita Sadasivan to speak a few words and get this discussion started.
Hello everyone, and warm good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And so today's discussion holds very high importance because it deals with the most marginalized group, that is persons with disabilities, and with regard to the current COVID situation, it's all the more important to
Frozen.
General Secretary of Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, UK, and we have Dr. Komal Kamara, General Secretary of the Spinal Foundation, India, and we also have Mihir Mohanty, Program Director of Swabiman. Then we have Mr. Prasanna Kurupu from Sri Lanka, and Ms. Abia Akram, Chair of Asia Pacific Women with Disabilities Network from Pakistan, and Emily Goes from South Africa, to discuss about persons with autism. So our first topic, and very significant and important topic, is humanitarian responses in Commonwealth countries and inclusion of persons with disabilities. I invite Mr. Richard Razor to discuss this, to present his views on this topic, and to introduce Mr. Richard Razor. He's a disabled teacher, trainer, writer, speaker, campaigner, filmmaker, and an international advocate, consultant for inclusive education and disability equality. He runs World of Inclusion Limited. He has held many positions, including UK representative on the European Disability Forum from 2004 to 2012, chair of the Alliance for Inclusive Education, and vice chair of Council for Disabled Children for 12 years, and on various UK government committees. In 2019, Richard was instrumental in restarting the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum and is currently elected General Secretary. I invite you, Mr. Richard Razor.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Can I be made co-host so I can share a screen, please? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that working? No. No. I don't think that's going to work. I'll stop the share. Doesn't seem to work. Anyway, it's been good to be here. I think we need to look back at what has been really a wake-up call to the whole world, and just think that the pandemic is still going on. The latest figures from the World Health Organization suggest that there have been 251 million infections around the world and 5,777,000 deaths to date. So this is a big impact on the world, and it took us a long time to wake up. Looking at it from a broader perspective, representing the Commonwealth, which, as people will know, is 54 countries, ranging from India, a massive population, through Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, all of which are big countries, to tiny small island countries who are, just by aside, still very cross with what happened in Glasgow, because although the world came together, it didn't actually reach agreement to save their homes, and unless something really happens. And why I'm talking about climate change, if we can't collaborate on an issue of the survival of the whole human race, then it's unlikely that we will collaborate properly on saving disabled people from being most at risk of various viruses which will come from time to time. And incidentally, the more we go into the last places of wilderness in the world, the more we will encourage crossovers of viruses such as the COVID-19 into the human population. We've already seen this with SARS and bird flu. So this, we know, is going to happen. And so it is in our direct interest as human beings, but particularly across the Commonwealth, whereas several of the introducers said, we have this unique link between rich developing countries, and the poorest countries. And we need to actually move that on from being a collection of countries that used to be in the British Empire to one that actually collaborates on a global scale, because we all have democratic governments and therefore our citizens have more say than many other countries in the world. So citizens in the Commonwealth have much more say than a citizen in Russia or China, where there's very little say in political matters. And therefore, we have a way of uniting ourselves around some of these issues. Now, COVID impacted on our rights in a number of ways. Most of the countries of the world, 162 of them, had signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that was agreed by the UN in 2006, came into force in 2008. And by this year, with Botswana being the latest to join, we have 162 that have not only said, yes, we think that's a good idea, but have agreed that they will implement it within their domestic law. Now, Article 11 talks about emergency situations, and I'm afraid to say that all countries in the world were found wanting, particularly across the Commonwealth, in terms of making sure that disabled people were at the forefront of their thinking when it came to implementing measures to control the pandemic by lockdowns and various other methods. And we know, because we collected data from our members across the Commonwealth, and we rehearsed these arguments in our training course that many people took part in last year, and all the materials are still up on our website, free of access. The following things, excuse me, became very obvious. That even if, like the government of India, they said, we will provide welfare packages to people in their homes, when we drill down, and your own organization, Swabiman, did survey work on this to demonstrate it, that the actual reach was not there. It wasn't getting to people in their homes, in their local communities. The distribution of food, the distribution of medicines, things like nappies and other things that people needed were not getting to them. People who used to provide support and visit at home were not able to because of lockdown. And so people were in a very parlous state. Secondly, there was no real recognition that where large numbers of disabled people, contrary to Article 19 of the Convention that says we should be empowered and supported to live in our local communities, where large numbers of disabled people are living in institutions, whether they be care homes, hospitals, asylums, orphanages, these were the places where there were the highest rates of casualties around the world and where there were the highest deaths. And so no real measures were taken to protect those people. Indeed, a number of politicians in Australia, the UK, and elsewhere were heard to be talking in very eugenicist terms, that actually it is an issue, when it really comes down to it, of survival of the fittest. Well, the whole reason that we have the UN and the human rights conventions is because we don't accept the thinking of Adolf Hitler. That is why the world came together and said, we will take a stand against this abuse. So we are for equal human rights for all people. The trouble is that that hasn't really permeated into the economic and social structures in the societies we live in. And my point from the beginning is it has to, if we are to survive as a human race. Things will have to change dramatically. And the fact that India, along with other governments, South Africa and China, diluted the move away from coal is a sign that the world is not yet ready to make these changes. But if we don't really move them forward, we're going to have a real problem. The second thing we found from our members was that the government was not sending out messages in an accessible format. For instance, in Canada, people with learning difficulties had to write the advice themselves so that people with learning difficulties would get it in easy read pictogram format. People with sign language use had to take their governments in several places, including the UK government, to court to actually ensure that sign language interpretation was part of the ministerial broadcasts that became a habit during the pandemic and went out very often. So in addition to this, information was not permeating down to those people who support and work with their disabled family members to support them. So they were just not getting information. And a good example in Uganda, where lockdown was enforced very strongly by the police and military, one disabled person, deaf disabled person, was shot and another was killed by overzealous guards challenging at distance deaf people to say why they were out. They clearly hadn't got the message. That's just not acceptable, that the state doesn't understand its role in actually policing things in a way that includes everybody. So it was a non-inclusive policing. What we also recognize is that different governments had different solutions to this, some quite realistic within the Commonwealth, New Zealand particularly, where there have been very low casualties. Australia to start with low casualties, but then got quite significant, but very low levels. Canada up at about 29,000 deaths, compared to India, where we have nearly 500,000 now. 462,000 people have died, and 34 million have actually had the infection. Now, there's no excuse to say, well, India's population is 1.3 million or 1.3 billion, therefore it's a small proportion. It's actually still a large number of people, and we need to remember that. Other countries in the Commonwealth who were hit hard was South Africa. So it's not just a subcontinent thing. Southern Africa got really bad, and surrounding countries it passed on to, but also Malaysia with 2.5 million infections for quite a small population and 29,000 deaths. South Africa, 89,000 deaths, and Bangladesh didn't seem to have the same spread as in India, but nevertheless 1.5 million people were infected and 27,000 deaths, 28,000 deaths in Pakistan, and 1.278. Nigeria, which is the largest populous country in Africa, and most of West Africa, seemed to be not get it very much. Only 2,900 deaths for a population of 180 million. So it's been very uneven, and some of our small island countries took measures, not those in the Caribbean, but particularly those in the Pacific, that meant there were no infections. So we have a very wide spectrum there, and we learned from this. A number of governments listened to us and actually took on the message of disabled people that we were bringing forward. And therefore, there were changes in Malaysia, there were changes in New Zealand, Australia, there were changes in India, although it still didn't permeate down as far as it should, and at least at a national level in South Africa, Malawi. But we have a long, long way to go to be automatically included in these discussions. So what for the way forward? Well, one area that was particularly badly affected was education, because the lockdown really just was a very blunt tool. And right across the board, the lockdown knocked out children, and those who could afford it or had the capability for IT could follow their lessons on computers, on the internet. But let's remember, the vast majority of people have no internet connectivity, and even if they've got a handheld mobile phone, which many more people do have now, it's very difficult, and that would be for the whole family, for children to access it. And say you've got 4 children at different levels of the curriculum, very, very hard. Then add to that children who are getting support with the push towards inclusive education across the world. Many disabled children were in school, but what we're seeing is that they're not returning now that the lockdown is finished. So that it will take a big knockback on inclusive education, and there have to be ways thought to break through that. Now, some young people, and perhaps Emile will say more about this, preferred not going to school if they could access the internet, because they're annoyed by all the interference they get, particularly on the spectrum, from all their peers around them, and they could just concentrate on learning. But of course, they're missing the social aspect of learning. And so we have to find ways of bringing everyone back into education. But I think we need to develop a much more flexible curriculum, much more flexible methods of assessment, which includes a hybrid of home working and school working, and move away from the teacher being at the front telling everybody what to think, to the teacher being a facilitator of lots of different ways of learning. And we have to keep pushing for this to happen. And what governments which say, oh yes, we'll sign up to Article 24, don't understand, it means overhauling the entire education and examination system to make it much more flexible. That doesn't mean demoting the value of it. It means enhancing it so that more people can demonstrate what they can do in a multiplicity of ways. So we need to do that as well. And perhaps most of all, to finish on, we need to ensure that the sorts of figures that we had in the UK, where we have 1/5 of the population, quite high, identified through the census as disabled people, yet we had 60% of the deaths were that 1/5 in that population of 1/5. So 3 times as high representation as there should have been, and particularly high amongst people with learning difficulties, young people with learning difficulties, 30 times higher than the rest of the population. This should be ringing alarm bells with government. It did for a short time and then they've forgotten about it, but it requires long-term strategies to deal with these things. And we think, to end with, in the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, we think it's really important that we identify ourselves as who we are. We are people with a whole multitude of impairments, which is a loss of physical, mental function, sensory function. But we are disabled by society's lack of adjustment to us, to their removing the barriers. And you can see no better illustration of this than what happened during COVID. So we mustn't hide ourselves or develop euphemisms for ourselves. We must say, yes, we are disabled people. We are the disabled people's movement. We welcome the allies we have, parents, families, supporters, but you must listen to us. Nothing about us without us. We will say what needs to happen. And that includes people with mental health issues and people with learning difficulties. They need to be given the space and the way for them to actually express their views, and we try and do that throughout the Commonwealth, and we're happy to work with Swabhiman and other organizations in India to take these goals forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Razor. So it was a really rich information from you when you were talking about the utmost vulnerability faced by persons with disabilities across the globe during humanitarian emergencies. You also mentioned about the hybrid of home working and school working for children with disabilities as the current need. And you also motivated people with disabilities in a rights-based approach, so that, you know, to break the attitudinal barriers and to advocate for ourselves, like you mentioned, how the advocacy of persons with disabilities have made some changes in certain countries. So thank you very much for that information. Now I would invite Ms. Komal Kamra, who is the General Secretary of Spinal Foundation India. So she will be talking on the topic of health and the disabled in India during COVID-19 pandemic with reference to spinal cord injury. Dr. Komal Kamra is an alumnus of University of Delhi, where she did her higher studies and taught for more than 44 years and retired. 39 years on her feet, and the later 27 years on a wheelchair post spinal cord injury. Komal Kamra chose to continue her academic career, but added a strong social element to her life. Despite her wheelchair, she loved to travel, makes friends, and live life king size. She's also a peer counselor in Indian Spinal Injury Center, New Delhi. She is the founder member and secretary of the Spinal Foundation, a pan-India group for persons with spinal cord injury. Dr. Komal Kamra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Smita. I will straight away go on to a screen share. Yes. Does that bring it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good to go? Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes on the spinal cord injury a bit, and then what the Spinal Foundation did during COVID-19 times and continues to do so. About spinal cord injury. The multiple systems in the human body are regulated by the nervous system and the hormones. The nervous system has a central nervous system, the brain, and that spinal cord that runs right down our backbone, a set of nerves that emanate from the spinal cord to different parts of the body, and autonomic nervous system that regulates many of the internal physiological processes. The spinal cord transmits signals in such a way that from, say, for example, if I put my hand into a bucket of water before I bathe, and it is warmer than what I require, then the information goes to my brain, and then it comes back to my hand and says, take it out, put some more water, cold water, so that it is better. Now, an insult to the spinal cord injury due to traumatic or non-traumatic reasons severs the signaling system. So if that's the level of my injury, below the level of my injury, whatever happens will not go to my brain to be processed. A spinal cord injury at one stroke takes away sensory and motor functions. Motor functions people still do identify when I use a wheelchair, but sensory functions are more important. Loss of skin sensation, compromised lung capacities, and that's the one to remember. Bladder and bowel incontinence. Most of you know when your bladder is full and you can empty it out. I won't, so I'll need alternate methodologies. So it also affects the sexual dysfunction and many others. So persons with spinal cord injury are going to be more susceptible to infections such as COVID-19 because, remember, we have compromised lung capacities, and the impact of the infection is also going to be more severe. Realizing this, the Spinal Foundation made a quick response. Let me tell you a bit about the Spinal Foundation. It's an umbrella organization which was conceptualized in 2013 and came into existence in 2014, but partners with about 50 plus organizations, including Swabhiman, which work inclusively and exclusively in the spinal cord injury space. Some of these organizations have been there for many, many years, and others nascent. What was our response to COVID-19? When the caseload in our country was less than 20 or just about 20 plus, we swung into action by sending messages: save yourself, don't get the infection, and keep assessing yourself. How? By doing breath counts. The methodology of spreading this information was through our partner organizations and through a hub and spokes network that TSF had established for a two-way dissemination of information between a person with spinal cord injury and us. And of course, through our website in 18 different languages, we disseminated the same information. So we, of course, used a whole lot of social media in this context. We also appealed to the central government to put spinal cord injury among the comorbidities to be addressed first by the healthcare system, and this was accepted by the concerned ministry. Spinal cord injury has no cure. Prevention is cure. But if you get spinal cord injury, rehabilitation is the only way to learn alternate methodologies of movement, like I use a wheelchair, bladder and bowel management, skin care, amongst others. Appropriate rehabilitation will help a person with spinal cord injury lead a near normal life, and with, of course, help from caregivers, leading to community inclusion. And Shruti is an example. She's doing wonderful things, not just community inclusion. You don't even look at her as a person on a wheelchair. Rehabilitation requires a group of health professionals who assess your injury. You go through a rehab protocol, checking on the progress from time to time, setting and resetting goal plans for the person with spinal cord injury. Rehabilitation requires institutionalization and is physiatrist driven. But what happened during COVID-19? Rehabilitation took a back seat. COVID-19 overwhelmed the healthcare system, and everybody knows this. Everywhere, not only in India. Hospitals were unsafe for persons with spinal cord injury for rehabilitation. That's another thing. So TSF developed an alternate system of an in-house rehabilitation. We began somewhere in May end last year, but once we were on firm grounds, we inaugurated it on our Independence Day last year. Initially, we called it Touch Rehab, and later to Touch Freedom, because that's what was giving freedom to people. What was the process? A group of peers and health professionals interacted via video calls to the injured person and an identified caregiver from the family. So you have two people there in the family, an injured person and a caregiver. During the video call, the patient, along with the caregiver, went through the rehab protocols under the guidance of an assigned mentor. For example, if there is a physiotherapy session to be conducted, a physiotherapist guiding the caregiver to do the exercises for the person with disability. A person with spinal cord injury, sorry. Now, during this session, there is no contact between the rehab professional and the family. The family is in the safe confines of their own home, and the therapist is elsewhere. And you could unite anybody in Northeast India to somebody in South India the same way. Touch Freedom has brought us a huge amount of success and still continues. Along the way, we also realized there were old cases of spinal cord injury who, due to lack of knowledge or reasons of affordability, could not join a rehab program and were living in the confines of their own four walls. We took them also in the program. So those who had done rehabilitation also developed complications. Those were also handled in this program. And that's the report card till 31st October 2021. The number of trainees who completed independent living training, 57. Those who are undergoing the training, 60. And we still have 8 as waitlisted. We did look at bladder and bowel management. Some people came forward and said they needed help there. So 62 people needed help, and we gave it to them. Apart from this, there were miscellaneous complications which were managed, 3 fractures, 8 bed sores, and 13 pain management and other conditions. Now, if a person with spinal cord injury did contract COVID-19, peer mentors and peer trainers guided these persons who did contract the infection to sail them through to safety, many times without even hospitalization. This needed man hours given by peers. First of all, they needed to understand all facets of COVID-19, and then to help their peers under, of course, telemedical counseling by doctors. Doctors didn't have enough time. So one would listen to them and then guide the family through. The pandemic threw challenges, but was met with opportunities. Wars are won by people who make opportunities out of challenges. Thank you so much. Happy to help and happy to be a minuscule part of this mega event. Thank you so much for inviting me to 2021, Anjali.
Thank you very much, Dr. Komal Kamra. It was really an enlightening session, and thank you very much for giving us the information, basic information about spinal cord injury, what is spinal cord injury, and also stressing the importance of rehabilitation in a person with spinal cord injuries life. And you also mentioned about the response to COVID-19, which you took up very initially, only when the cases were just 20, and you created a great awareness across the country among persons with spinal cord injury. And you also worked with the government to recognize spinal cord injury as a comorbidity, and the Touch Freedom initiative by your organization is amazing. It has really created a huge impact among persons with spinal cord injuries lives. Thank you so much for your work, and thanks for the presentation. Thank you very much. Now, is Mr. Mihir Mohanty available?
No, he hasn't yet reached home.
Okay, fine. So hope nothing major serious is there with this accident. We will move on to the next speaker, Mr. Prasanna Kurupu, who is a disability rights advocate and a campaigner for humanitarian disarmament. He is the officer designated for international and regional affairs by Disability Organizations Joint Front Sri Lanka. He is also the president of Sri Lanka Foundation for the Rehabilitation of the Disabled. He is the executive officer of Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. I welcome Mr. Prasanna Kurupu to talk about information and communication challenges for the disabled during COVID-19 lockdowns. Mr. Prasanna, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this valuable program organized by Swabiman. And can I share the screen? Okay, now for the next 10 minutes, I'm planning to take you a little bit about the importance of information and communication during a humanitarian emergency situation. Before that, I would like to take you just to look at how the information and communication is mentioned in the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In the Article 2, it very explained the definition of communication and also the reasonable accommodation, where the information and also the how we should define communication and information in the context of person with disabilities. So it is very important for us to refer and understand what the definition says in the CRPD. And also you can see in the general principles under Article 3, the accessibility is one of the key areas mentioned in the general principles. So when we read the UNCRPD, we have to make sure that we will always keep in mind how important the accessibility, where it has reasonable mention to access for information as well. In the Article 5 also, under equality and non-discrimination, the reasonable accommodation is one of the key words mentioned, where it's specifically related to the information and communication. And Article 6 and 7, you know, it's about women and also girls and also children. And again in Article 8, awareness raising is another key article where receptiveness and perceptions, rights, respects and dignity, those kind of very important facts are in the agenda of awareness raising, especially to educate the public and other related stakeholders when we work with a person with disability. So these articles are very, very important. And again, Article 9, accessibility, specifically mentioned about access to information and communications, the internet, the electronic services and emergency services. So when you look at the format of the UNCRPD, we can see the preference, the priority given in these two areas, like the information and communication, how it has been mentioned in the UNCRPD. And the Article 21, the freedom of expression, opinion, and access to information, there also the information in accessible formats should be given in timely manner and free of charge, and also choice of the person with disability to receive those information in alternative communications, sign and braille, and also giving the public service providers some guidelines how to make information accessible and also use in usable formats, and digital accessibility and also use of sign language. These are the key points covered in Article 21 of the UNCRPD. So it is very evident looking at these articles how many times this is repeating within and how they have prioritized in the UNCRPD format. And Article 11 specifically mention about the situation of risk and humanitarian emergencies, and when we talk about situation of risk, the armed conflict, the humanitarian emergencies and natural disasters. Here we don't have specifically mention about pandemic situations, but it is naturally a humanitarian emergency. If we compare what is going on in the world today, the COVID-19 pandemic, we can somewhat match it with similar to an armed conflict, because it has so many restrictions, lockdowns, and so many new rules. There are, people never thought that, world will have to stop like this. So this is a very good situation for us to understand when once it comes to this kind of a pandemic situation, how to react. So again, if you really look at the Article 11, before we discuss most of the civil and political rights as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, the Article 11 has come in precedence soon after Article 10, Article 9 accessibility, Article 10, and Article 11. During the drafting time, the drafters have realized how important this situation of risk and humanitarian emergency. That's why they have taken this particular thematic area into Article 11. Other than this, I'm sure most of you are aware of what are the interagency standing committee guidelines on humanitarian actions. So the interagencies have come up with so many guidelines, and there are so many thematic areas, and access to information and also communication is one of the key areas under these guidelines. So it is also a very good point for us to understand how important, what kind of an important role when the communication and information plays in everyone's life in normal day-to-day context, as well as very severely in humanitarian emergencies. Now let's look at the challenges in communication and movement, especially the mode of communication and physical mobility are some serious factors two serious components of every person with disability once it comes to their well-being and day-to-day activities. If you take the physical disability, the disability type, the mode of communication is mostly usual modes. Their disability is physical, but they can use most of the communications modes for their day-to-day communication. But mobility, they are dependent on helpers and assistants. And blind or visually impaired people, they always need voice or braille communication. But the mobility also they depend on sometimes, most of the time, with helpers and assistants. And deaf and hearing impaired, the sign language and visual formats, no voice kind of communications are their mode of communication. Also text capturing, and there are so many other formats. So they can looking at the things from their eyes and understand things. And fortunately, mobility, they are capable of managing on their own. The intellectual development disabilities, the slow and short sentences by parents or guardians are the most of the communication mode. The mobility also, they are mostly dependent on the parents, guardians, or caretakers. So psychological disorders, people with psychological disorders, they also depend on severity of their conditions, and their mobility also depend on the caretakers and assistants most of the time. So when you look at these are very, very roughly I put these categories together, but when you look at this different type of categories, their mode of communication and mobility are different. And also let's look at how the likelihood of access to information. The physical disability generally have access but limited due to social and attitude barriers. Blind and visually impaired can gather oral instructions and text in braille, have access to ICT and but limited due to cost constraints, especially in the developing countries, first world countries and second world countries. We can see most of the ICT alternatives are there, but the poor countries and third world developing countries, they find it very difficult to afford for these kind of communication technologies. Deaf and hearing impaired, least access to information, only mode is sign language interpretation as it happens, or text capturing and visual formats, hardly available in many countries. For example, the text capturing is something we don't have in Sri Lanka. I have never experienced in text capturing in Sri Lanka. Once Steve visited Sri Lanka some time back. That's the first time I saw text capturing about 10 or 15 years ago. Intellectual development disabilities, considerably they have access and not up to the expected standard, as I mentioned earlier, mostly depend on the parents and guardians. So you can see how many and so many people are involved in the whole process of getting access to information and also mobility for persons with disabilities. But now let's just look at how during the different stages of person with disabilities life, their social integration and how does it affect, especially during very small ages, family. Normal conditions generally they look after very well by the family or the community. And community integration, especially when the children during the early childhood development of school education time, considerably look after well, but by family, community and other service providers. Social integration is the part when the child goes out from the school and looking for vocational training or maybe employment. That's the time where they really get socially participate, possibly of situations, some situations most likely they get subject to abuse or bullying or other violences. And the risk factor is always there's a risk, even in normal conditions. This situation becomes worse when there is a emergency situation like a COVID pandemic or any other humanitarian emergency. For the family, even sometimes the family members can neglect their own children due to the severity of the situation. We have seen it during this pandemic time and even during some of the humanitarian disasters. Sometimes the family members are neglect their own children because the situation has prioritized them to look into some other aspects of life than looking after their children. So 10 minutes negligence can lead to so many disaster situations. Again, in community level, possibility there is a neglect and risk. It's higher than family members, but from the community and also service providers. And we have heard from the earlier panelists that how the services, the rehabilitation services and other support services collapse during times of pandemics and emergencies. So that will result neglect and more risk for persons with disabilities. The social integration, again, in that aspect, the higher possibility of neglect and risk by family, community, and service providers depend on the serial. I mean, this factor we have experienced during the last 2 years, how people have reacted when the governments are struggling to fight with so many other priorities, they neglect persons with disabilities. So during pandemics, the risk is very high and persons with disabilities are very much vulnerable. So a CPDF policy on humanitarian and situations and disability 2020 also specifically mentioned 4 principles on the communication information. It says development end-to-end early warning system is fundamental to save lives when disaster occurs, developing and maintaining all visible channels for open communication within and across vulnerable groups. Early warning system should be accessible for disabled people and other groups, especially people who are deaf and deaf-blind and have hearing difficulties. Establishment of a hotline for disabled people to call the local government councils. These are the policy of Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum developed in 2020. So it also has stress how the immediate responses to a disaster. These are the kind of communication and information factors in our policy. CPDF also did so many interventions during the pandemic time. We had 2 summits, online summits in April and June, and also every discussion, the importance of communication and information and collapse are the main factors for isolating and segregating persons with disabilities and excluding them in all the other relief programs. Since my time is past, I will just go through a small case study in Sri Lanka. During this pandemic, the sooner it started, we have communicated with Disability Organization Joint Front, has communicated with the authorities, and we managed to have a disability help center. And through that center, we managed to gather information about the complaints and other issues faced by persons with disabilities. Especially, this center has supported the deaf community because they were the most affected people without proper information. And as a result, we managed to get some relief from the government, put forward their request and other issues to the government and get remedies. So we have not stopped from there. We have continued with the stakeholder engagement. And as a result of that, we managed to have a media center, media service center for the disabled at the Government Information Department. And that service center is functional now. And also recently, about 1 month back, the second state electronic media TV station, main TV station, started to give sign language interpretations during the main news program. And also, for the first time in the Sri Lankan history, the National Budget Debate 2022, which is very much important for all people because of the budget coming in a pandemic situation. The entire 12 days from day before yesterday and up to 22nd, we are having sign language interpretations during the Parliament debate supported by the UNDP. So all these things are actually some of the dialogues and interventions made by the DOJ. So we have a lot of seriously non-inclusion things happen during the whole pandemic, like the government when making decisions and making interventions, they have not followed the proper inclusive principles. It is like trial and error method. Sometimes they have come up with so many solutions, but it will not cater for the people, so they have changed it. So that happens when we don't have inclusive approaches for making decisions. And what we have experienced is the person with disabilities and most of the vulnerable groups comes at the very last section to look after. when making public level decisions. But on the other hand, we managed to somewhat get some positive results by having some intervention with the government officials, especially for into this right to information and communication. So having said that, I like to conclude my intervention, small intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurupu, for that really detailed explanation. How much priority accessibility and accessible information is given in by the CRPD, and you also stressed upon the importance of communication and information being accessible during humanitarian emergencies. You also stressed upon the guidelines for humanitarian emergencies to be made accessible, and you touched upon the challenges faced by people with disabilities because of lack of accessibility in the information and communication system. And you also gave some case studies about your experience from your organization and from your country working with the government on how you came up with certain positive aspects with regard to creating a media center, creating a information and communication system accessible for people with disabilities in your country. Thank you so much for that. Now I would move on to our next speaker, Ms. Abia Akram, chairperson of Asia Pacific Women with Disabilities Network of Pakistan. And she will be addressing on the topic experiences and challenges of women and children with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. A brief about Abia. Abia Akram has been engaged in the activities of disability movement since 1997. In the struggle of giving voice to women with disabilities, she has been lobbying with parliamentarians, UN high-level representatives, focusing on developing advocacy strategies to raise awareness, network, and build capacity. She also coordinates efforts of including persons with disabilities in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, she established National Forum of Women with Disabilities and has been recently assigned the responsibility as chairperson, Asia Pacific Women with Disabilities Network. And Abia is a very good friend of all of us in the international platform. Welcome, Abia. The floor is yours.
Abia hasn't yet joined Smita. I don't see her on the screen. So we will move on and then I will just talk to her.
Okay. Fine. So, so our next speaker is Ms. Emile Gauss. Hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Emile Gauss is a special educator and a PhD student, vice chairman of the National Executive Committee of Autism of South Africa, and represents neurodiversity at the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. He only started displaying autism ASD tendencies at the age of 3 years old. It came to light when he started challenges in language and communication. He was nonverbal till the age of 15 years and learned more through visual stimulation. With his parents and therapist support, he has persons with autism and COVID-19. Here you go, Emile.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Can I ask, can you please make me a presenter so that I can share my screen?
Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I really want to thank everyone for for allowing me to speak at this wonderful and global initiative. It's also a big privilege for me to speak at this event and to speak with my fellow CDPF members. As you know, that the recent COVID-19 pandemic has elaborated on the inequalities that we as persons with disabilities experience. And as you would listen to the different presentations, you would notice that although our challenges, our impairments, our disabilities is different, we still experience certain barriers in a similar way. Now, when you look specifically from a South African perspective, the recent COVID-19 pandemic had its unique consequences, especially when lockdown was implemented. And like I said, the pandemic magnified pre-existing inequalities. Some of the challenges that we experience, especially coming from a third world country, was public travel restrictions. Since the announcement of the national lockdown, neurodiverse individuals have been exploited, and it affected their families from low to middle income countries. Social distancing and other measures disrupted the routines and caused a greater sense of anxiety and frustration. As an adult on the autism spectrum, we needed to get used to new words and phrases such as social distancing, the new normal, and as we know, as Richard mentioned, that this COVID-19 pandemic introduced us to different changes in terms of technology and information on various avenues such as education. But when you look specifically at the autism spectrum, how did this COVID-19 pandemic affect us? Well, you need to look at specific avenues, and referring to research, this COVID-19 pandemic, especially the nationwide lockdown, disrupted our daily routines. We found that healthcare facilities and therapeutic intervention became inaccessible. Now, when you look specifically at education, we saw that there has been a major inequality when you consider education, because some of your private schools, as well as your specialist schools, transitioned to an online teaching, whereas your public schools were closed. We need to get used to the health regulations, such as wearing a mask, reminding ourselves as well as students to continuously washing and sanitizing our hands, and to portray social distancing. There was also insufficient surveillance systems, and there was also a scarcity of trained personnel. And as we know that referring to the autism spectrum and referring to the diagnosis, some of your families and the autistic child is dependent on the caregivers. And as such, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, these families could not gain the services of the facilitators or caregivers. And as such, these caregivers needed to apply for special permits in order for them to do their work. Now, what was the effect of the nationwide lockdown? Now, when you look specifically at the autism spectrum, individuals living with autism require various levels of support. And as I said, many of us are dependent on caregivers, but many are still at increased risk of contracting COVID-19 due to the numerous preconditions that we might have. Therefore, persons with autism, especially caregivers, was continuously reminded to take special precautions to minimize the risk of transmitting the virus. But during the the lockdown period, we tend to find that we experience heightened levels of frustration and anxiety due to the break in routines, a lack of resources, as well as a lack of appropriate engagement. Due to the numerous communication challenges that individuals on the autism spectrum experience, we are also referred to as a vulnerable group, as females were exposed to gender-based violence. But to ensure that persons with disabilities receive accessible information during this critical time, the Gender-Based Violence Command Center was established in order to deal with these challenges. But here in South Africa, we tend to find that our non-profit organizations, such as Autism South Africa, communicated on government level to ease the lockdown restrictions, to allow for daily walks and exercise for autistic people and their caregivers. We also wrote to government to ensure that these families have access to their facilitators or caregivers to give home support. We also found that funds were made available to help families, and we also participate in feeding schemes to feed people from low to middle income families. But unfortunately, we found that there was a failure of government to act fast to support autistic people and their families. And as such, referring to the diagnosis, it also contributed to mental health concerns, and families were already in a crisis. Well, it's important to take note that not all autistic, referring to neurodiversity, experience similar challenges. When you look at the diagnosis, considering the high functioning and low functioning diagnosis, majority of your individuals who's on the high functioning side of the autism spectrum could integrate on a cognitive and social level, and they actually cope generally well. But these individuals still needed a secure and structured environment. We tend to find that when their routines were disrupted, they socially regressed, and we also find that these individuals also tend to lose their jobs, which contribute towards the unemployment rate. And considering mental health, these individuals experience loneliness and uncertainty, which is associated with anxiety and but organizations like Autism South Africa basically wrote a letter with the support of 8 autistic organizations within the country to render support for individuals and families. But to support families from low to middle income group, they help to pack education support materials to support the families, to help their development on emotional, social, cognitive, as well as physical development. We also receive and distribute essential donations, such as sanitary towels and diapers. The organization, although they limited their contact of people, they provided counseling services online to support families. and all training and awareness events were made online. But what was the consequence of this? We tend to find that individuals living with autism, are part of the marginalized group, and COVID-19 has exploited this. And therefore, we identified the gap that more awareness must be created in order to support, in order to ensure that individuals with autism within our country are accommodated and included so that the reasonable accommodations are made. Thank you for your time and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Emile. That was really nice of you to explain the different barriers which different persons with disabilities face. It is not the same barriers which all of us face. And you really explained about how social distancing or wearing a mask or washing hands were kind of creating some issues, and it was very difficult for people with autism to accommodate or accustom to the new normal, and how it affected the mental health, created depression and anxiety among persons with autism, and the families were also suffering because of inaccessible caretaking services because of the new normal that government has announced. You also mentioned about how the new normal has affected or impacted adversely with the therapeutic interventions, livelihood, education, leisure, or daily routines of people with autism. And yes, of course, there are insufficient surveillance system which has to be changed. And good that you have been working with the government of South Africa to change this. And together we have to bring a change, is the message that we are taking from your session. Thank you so much for that. Now I would request Dr. Shruti Mohapatra to address on accessibility, disability, inclusion, and COVID-19 response. Dr. Shruti Mohapatra is a disability expert and an activist since 22 years. This TEDx speaker is the founder and CEO of Swabhiman, Disability Information and Resource Center. By her pioneering efforts, disability has become not only visible, but an important social issue for Odisha and Indian government and civil society. She has won 75 plus awards. She is a member of many committees in the government. She has over 100 publications in articles, papers, and books to her credit. Over to you, Shruti.
Thank you, Smita. Thank you for your kind words. Esteemed co-panelists and distinguished audience out there, I'm going to talk about an important concept, which is accessibility. And the COVID-19 pandemic brought something to the fore, that is the fissures and the gaps in our service delivery to the disabled. Though we can divide the countries in the Commonwealth into two groups, the developed and the developing countries, or the countries with lower development, one can see that there was one thread which was common to all people with disabilities across the Commonwealth, and that is lack of access to different kind of services, information, and essential medicines. Just a minute. Accessibility has been given a lot of importance. Earlier, it was always defined as physical accessibility or accessibility. And as the journey continued, it became ICT accessibility, accessibility to the web, or accessibility to people's attitude. But the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability gave it a more emphatic definition, which was just now explained also by a previous panelist, Mr. Prasanna Kurupa, that UNCRPD did not just focus on the term accessibility, it went a step ahead and it talked about universal design and accessibility standards. So, thus, the UNCRPD, if you look at it, you will find the human rights principle of accessibility running through all the chapters. And specifically, if you look at personal mobility, education, habilitation, rehabilitation, employment, adequate standard of living, in all these chapters, you will find mention of accessibility. The purpose behind this was to emphasize the fact that it is not enough to devise schemes, it is not enough to allocate a budget, but it is very important to ensure that people with disabilities for whom the services are being planned, for whom the policies and schemes are being planned, have access to those. In the lines of the CRPD, in 2006, the UNCRPD was created. By 2008, many countries, over 160 countries, they had either signed it or they had ratified it. And India was one of the first countries to ratify the UNCRPD. So member countries, when they ratified CRPD, they were mandated. They were mandated to change all their domestic laws to the rights-based definition. So what did the CRPD actually achieve? If we ask this one question, then the answer would be the CRPD changed the paradigm of disability by moving disability away from charity, development, economy, and focusing on only one thing, that is rights of people with disabilities, which meant if one was a child with disability, his or her rights were the same as any child with disability. If one is a woman with disability, then their rights were the same as all women of that age, that category. So also students with disabilities, their rights were equal to students of their class, their subjects, their uh, kinds of needs and selections. So what RPWD Act did was, it also ensured that accessibility is running through all its chapter. Besides having a section on accessibility, this word access and accessibility, if you go at length through the RPWD Act with a microscope, with a lens, you will find this word has been used 48 times, which emphasizes the importance given to accessibility by the law. Apart from physical accessibility, that is accessibility to buildings, accessibility to transport, lot of emphasis was given to information and communication technology, that web should be accessible, websites should be accessible, the process of collecting information from the website, the process of communication online, all these need to be accessible for all categories of people with disabilities. Like there should be people using braille should be able to access it, people using audio format should be able to access it, those with speech and hearing should be able to access it, those with cognitive disability should be able to access it. That was a wider definition which was done by the law. Apart from this, there were focus on two things. Since 2016, we have been hearing in India these two words, reasonable accommodation and universal design. Time and again, you see, earlier, the word disability was only used in the context of the International Day of the Disabled, or when the budget in India was made specifically for the assistive devices, distribution of aids and appliances, or a day dedicated to sports for the disabled. But as the rights-based law started taking inroads into the different departments, into the various schemes, in India, you started hearing this word reasonable accommodation again and again from experts and government functionaries alike. So, what is reasonable accommodation is a question. See, reasonable accommodation actually it empowers accessibility, or it actually, you can say, facilitates accessibility. Now, why the word reason? What is the word accommodation? We will go to that. Now, suppose I'm a person with a short height. Now, if I go to my classroom and the table and the chair are at very tall, very high, then I will not be able to sit. I will not be able to write. If I'm visually impaired and I have not been provided a scribe, then I will not be able to write. So, accommodation is to provide a support which will help me in my functional needs. For example, a scribe. Now, what you are doing is you are testing me at par with the other students of my class and my subject. Because now I have someone to write for me. So, all that I have to do is dictate. So also if the table and chair are of the right height, I don't need to jump, I don't need to take extra pain. I just will sit comfortably and start writing. Similarly, and how to explain it in a more simple language? Suppose India has thousands of languages and dialects and regional variations of those dialects. So suppose I'm a person who speaks only English and I go to a place where all communication is being done in Hindi. How will I communicate? How will I understand? Does that make me disabled? So, accommodation is needed there in terms of a translator who can make me understand what is being talked there. So, that's an accommodation. And why reasonable? Reasonable because you cannot burden small organizations. You cannot burden organizations. Now, if I go to a company where my office is in the first floor, I cannot demand that you give me an elevator or I will drag you to the court of law. What I can request is, can you please shift my classroom or my office to a ground floor building? So that is the reason, reasonable, so that it does not financially burden my institution or my company or the public space. The other is universal design. So why universal design is so important? Universal design is very important because I need to use a pen. You need to use a pen. All of us, many different people need to use a pen. So, but if this pen is not designed for people who are speech and hearing impaired, not designed for someone with an upper hand mobility, then how many different types of products that we are going to create? But if we design a computer in a way that it has a JAWS software embedded in it, then I can use it, a visually impaired person can use it. So universal design and reasonable accommodation are important features of accessibility. And if we just use the term accessibility, I write, I'm an accessible of school. And in India and in Odisha, my experiences, they just write, I'm an accessible school, I'm an accessible office. When you go there, all that is there to access is a ramp, which actually not a ramp in the right gradient. Now the codes they say, the guides they say, a ramp should have 1:12 or 1:15 gradient. But what do you find? Slopes. Slopes which people use to take their bikes or cycles inside the building. So reasonable accommodation, universal design, the right standards of accessibility are important features of the accessibility component of both the CRPD and the rights-based law in India. Unfortunately, what happened during the coronavirus global response across countries, whether it is India, whether it is Sri Lanka, Pakistan, UK, we found that when people were sitting together and taking decisions on how to manage the impact of COVID-19, how to reduce the impact of COVID-19, there were hardly people with disabilities in those discussion tables. And what was the outcome? Helplines were they were everywhere. Every 1 hour, you had all the major news channels talking about the recent cases, the facilities that have been created by the government, the places to go where to get your mask, sanitizer, free of cost. Countries like India and many other welfare states, they announced where can you go to get your free ration, where can you go to take some extra money. Students got information about where to collect digitized lessons for studies at home. While all this was going on, there was no talk of accessibility. As people with disabilities were not part of these decision making processes, somehow accessibility for the different categories of disability got completely missed out. And all of us know, as Mr. Richard Reiser just spoke, in India we don't have disaggregated data on disability, so we don't know how many deaths happen, but we all know large number of deaths happen. And in the UK, for every 10 people who died, 6 were people with disabilities. So this kind of gross apathy, gross neglect of people with disability, especially after the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, which gave a clarion call for inclusion, leaving no one behind, educating everyone together, brought everything to a halt. Disability groups, DPOs were very vocal about it. The good thing in this pandemic was people with disabilities, organizations of people with disabilities, disabled people organizations, networks of people with disabilities, parents of children with disabilities were very vocal. They said, you can't do this. We have now the CRPD. We have now individual domestic laws which talk about accessibility. Not just that, most of the laws, like the law in India, they talk about punishments. They talk about fines. And then there is the Inchi on strategy, which has been adopted by the different governments. We have a Right to Education Act in India. So with all these structures, the strong legal environment, how is it that people with disabilities were completely missed out? Why you are, I think Richard explained very nicely how they had to force their way for a sign language interpreter. I will give you my example in Odisha. You know, in Odisha, the government of Odisha, every 1 hour was giving a bulletin. There they were explaining the number of cases, positive cases, how many had recovered, how many had died, what are the services available, where people can go for a free testing, from where they can avail the free services. But there was no sign language interpreter. We had to practically write stinging letters. I personally picked up the phone and I talked to the secretaries, the chief secretary of Odisha, the minister, and I said, what are you doing? So the next day, after 2-3 days, we found there was a sign language interpreter standing there behind the government spokesperson and signing. And within 30 minutes, I received more than 50 telephone calls where people, friends and families and sign language interpreters saying that, ma'am, this person is making all the wrong signs. What the briefing is and what he is signing are completely different. So again, another round of advocacy, picking the phone, talking to them in stern voice, and you'll be stunned actually to know that I was told by none else then the secretary of the department which deals with disability, but we are okay with him. The chief secretary of Odisha is okay with him. I said, how many of you are hearing impaired? What do you mean you are okay with it? The people, just like for you and me, the ears are vessels through which we hear what is being spoken. So for the hearing impaired, it is the fingers of the sign language interpreter. And if the government is saying good, and the sign language interpreter is signing it as bad, if he or she is talking about rehabilitation or free ration, and the sign language interpreter is talking about toilets, then just think of the chaos you are creating for this section of people. So I almost lambasted and I said, if this change doesn't happen in the next hourly bulletin, we are going a big way for a press conference. But thankfully, within 2 hours, the sign language interpreter was changed and a good signing happened. So think about it. Strong legal environment in India, vocal persons with disabilities, and yet you often find the basic rights violated and the activist groups coming forward having to fight for the rights. So basic challenges that were faced was in communication, accessible information, and access to helplines. The other interesting thing was the helpline. Government started after this sign language interpreter episode. Government started advertising a telephone number again and again. Call in this number, call in people, the Divyang people, the Bhinnakshama people. They have many names for us. The Bhinnakshama people can call in this number, and the number is a audio line. Again, we started a round of advocacy. What is going on with you? How will a speech and hearing impaired person call? How will a cognitive person with cognitive disability call? How are they going to explain? They cannot talk. How about an intellectually disabled person? And despite advocacy, despite over 900 emails and letters being sent, that was one issue which was not addressed. And till now, the helplines continue to be only in the audio format in government. Then there was no access to essentials. There was no access to healthcare and medical aid. There was no access to painkillers and medicines that were badly needed. There was no access to caregivers, assistive devices, and support groups. There was no access to monetary gain. So this was a huge challenge that was faced by the disabled people in Odisha. You see, we had done that a profiling of disability in state of Odisha was done in 2012, and after that, nothing much has been done. If you go through those pages, you will find that most of the disabled people who are employed in Odisha, a small number are employed in the government, and a larger group is employed in the unorganized sector, in the NGOs, in the very small business houses. So what happened was job loss was immediate. It is only the big companies, very big multinational companies which paid their salary to their employees. But rest all companies, all the NGOs, all the small street vendors, all the unorganized sectors, they just closed shop. And so job loss was immediate. Lack of information in accessible format, and they could not access the government free services. Number 3, those living in remote areas, they could not go out. You see, advertisement came out that within 2 kilometers of your houses, whatever primary school is there, you can go there and collect the ration. Now think about this. Many areas in Odisha, they have hilly terrains, small plain land and tall hills, big hills, small hills. So think of the tribes who are living atop those hills. So 2.5 kilometers means coming down the steep hills, then crossing maybe a river, then walking by foot, then reaching the primary school or the vaccination center, which was 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, whatever. And for the lack of public transport, and for those on wheelchairs, and for those who do not have support mechanism at home, coming to the centers and collecting these free supplies was near impossible. And what are the other psychological issues? And we did not have. Unfortunately, it took a long time in India for the counseling, online counseling systems to come up, to begin. And bigger problem that, as I told you regarding the helpline, was none of these counseling sessions were in accessible format. So what the big hospitals like AIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, they printed a list of doctors and telephone numbers where you could access. But when you called them, either doctors did not respond or they were in a hurry. They had no time to listen to people who had speech impairment. Such practical issues abounded. And students and women. Now, my friend Abia was supposed to give you a lucid explanation to that, but because of lack of internet connectivity, she is not able to join us. Women with disabilities suffered immensely. I know the case of 2 or 3 women who had massive issues as far as violence and abuse and different issues are concerned. And same with students. We had many newspaper reports. We had been directly involved with 2 national and 1 state level, which we conducted surveys. And all the 3 surveys, it came out to the fore that women with disabilities were very badly abused, were sexually assaulted. They did not have access to basic needs like menstruation support or childbirth support. The pregnant women, they suffered a lot. And the students, 43% of the students, they dropped out of education system because of lack of hardware, lack of accessible education, lack of teachers who were sensitive to their needs, and lack of data. See, the India and the South Asian countries, we abound in people who are very poor. They live in villages and urban poor areas. So the entire household has a 2 GB data for the whole day. So they cannot afford to spend that 2 GB just for one child's education. So these practical issues need to be considered. And how can this be considered? Only when people with disabilities are there in the planning state, which the Sustainable Development Goals talk about, which the CRPD talks about, which the RPWD talks about. But unfortunately, what is happening in India and many countries is, for small things, you have to run to the courts. You have to get a order from them before small things happen. Now, way forward. Now, everybody is talking about building back better. So, if we really want to provide accessibility to people with disabilities, we want to provide them all the rights that are illustrated, that are reflected in our laws, then we need to consider a few things. Number one, this is a huge population, and 1 in 7 people worldwide has a disability. Not just that, women and girls with disabilities are at a higher risk. And if you look at India, the government does all its planning on the basis of a census, which is a government data, census data. The 2011 census data says in Odisha, in my state, we are only 12 lakhs 44,000 people. But if we consider 2015, when the World Bank, the World Health Organization World Report on Disability came, it states the population of disabled is 15%, whether it's a village, it's a town, a country, or a continent. And in 2016, we got a new law. And this new law increased the number of disabilities from 7 to 21. And then between 2011 to 2021, there has been a decadal growth in the population. So even by most conservative estimates, in the state of Orissa, we are 70 to 80 lakhs. So for a population of 70 to 80 lakhs, when we make plans and budget at the rate of 12 lakh people, the budget will be grossly inadequate and cannot support any of the schemes, cannot justify the schemes that are meant for disability. We have to consider the fact that many international good scientific documents have come out with the number that 20% of the poorest in the world have a disability. So, and we need to keep in mind that it's a vicious circle. Disability leads to poverty, poverty leads to disability. Hence, addressing poverty is very important to alleviate to move people with disability from the lowest strata of the society to reasonable living. Now, they suffer bad. This is a population that suffers barriers, and we must very, very carefully think about it. See, our barriers are not just limited to physical building, transport barrier, but we suffer language barrier, communication barrier, procedural barrier, environmental barriers. We suffer judicial barriers. And all these barriers have been very clearly illustrated in the new laws. So we need to take this law to each and every village of India. Not just the government functionaries, but every citizen of India needs to understand this law. Why? Because every family either has a person with disability, or in the extended family has a person with disability, or in the neighborhood, in the workplace has persons with disability. And we have to also keep in mind that this population is most susceptible to contracting the COVID-19 virus. Why? See, I'm a spinal cord injured person and I'm disabled below my neck. So if I am there, I have a disability, then I'm dependent on a caregiver. So unless my caregiver is super careful, we cannot maintain the social distance. So we are more susceptible. We are experiencing more severe symptoms. See, very recently in the past COVID pandemic, I lost a very dear friend. Komal Kamra also know we lost our very good friend Vaidyanathan. Why? He went to the hospital. He got the best of services, but we have reduced lung capacities in spinal cord injury. So that needs to be kept in mind. And that we have a elevated levels of death. And explained to you by Richard, you just heard, since they are very well documented, they have data, he said out of 10 deaths, 6 are people with disabilities. So to build back better, we have to embrace accessibility in all the spheres. And this is an example I have brought to you because this is a major problem all of us face. Everyone says, yes, we are accessible. But accessible is not a ramp, as I told earlier. Accessibility is not a slope. Even if we are talking about a ramp, it has to be a correct gradient of a ramp. And I have experienced this again and again in the state of Odisha. Government offices, philanthropic organizations, different schools and colleges which invite me for a lecture. This is what I have faced always. They'll tell me, I'll ask, do you have a lift? I became intelligent. Do you have an elevator? Yes, ma'am. And when I to reach the elevator, I have to climb up 4 steps. So this situation, this attitude needs to change. And all of us need to come together. Academicians, government functionaries, neighborhood, community, actors, directors, academicians, authors, politicians, legislators. When all of us come together, we all embrace differences and we all celebrate diversity. Accessibility will be achieved, and that's how we can provide support to people with disabilities. And as mandated now, they can live a life of dignity. We must all remember that the Sustainable Development Goals say individual dignity is foremost in achieving the goals and sustainability of the programs. So individual dignity of persons with disabilities, their participation and accessibility needs need to be prioritized for a country to be called truly accessible. Thank you so much. Thank you, Smita. Hello. Hello, Smita. Hello, Smita. Smita, please unmute.
Thank you very much, Shruti, for a very detailed session on accessibility and how we should voice our rights. And also you mentioned about the challenges faced by persons with disabilities in different aspects, like accessing services or there is no there is so much of issue with livelihood. There was lack of livelihood, lack of education, and lack of healthcare needs, healthcare services, and even the importance of addressing poverty is well brought out by you. And finally, you gave a very good insight about how everyone should come together, and only then we can build back better. And yes, I really second that thought, and of course everyone will definitely agree for that point. And myself being an advisory group member for the civil society engagement mechanism for the universal health coverage of 2030, the UN platform, when we look at the health systems of different countries working in silos and not including different stakeholders, that is where we lack. And once the healthcare requirements is made accessible and is inclusive of all people with disabilities, all primary stakeholders of different groups, then we have a base set up very strongly, and upon which we can look into the economic and social aspects development of diverse groups, including persons with disabilities. This is what we have been working at the UHC 2030 platform, and that aspect is also brought very well in this deliberation today. And going forward, do we have any questions for the panelists? Can we have the co-host to come up with any questions which the participants have asked?
Smita, there is a question that I have received from one of our scholars, and the question he has directed to Mr. Peter Dreiser. He says that could we hear a little more about what is happening in the UK, how they are able to address that, apart from he has clarified that not talking about being a developed country or resources, but how they have been able to be more successful in better addressing the needs of the people with disabilities during the COVID time as compared to India.
Mr. Richard?
Well,
can you
clearly, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Well, I'm not sure we have been better. We have this, I gave some statistics about the death rates, and they particularly were high in care homes. Nearly everyone in a care home is a disabled person because they go there because they can no longer look after themselves. Now, Article 19 of the Convention says that people should be given the resources so they can live in their own homes and the community. The fact that there are care homes is because of a failure of the social security system in the UK, which has been systematically cut back for the last 12 years. Ever since the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition came in 2010, and indeed the last part of the new Labour endeavour, they were cutting back on the benefits of disabled people, saying that there were too many people having these benefits. In fact, the government's own statistics show that a large number of people who were entitled to the benefits were not getting them. Now, all countries of the world linked to their standard of living under Article 28 are meant to guarantee that all disabled citizens have a reasonable standard of living. So this is not just something that should be happening in the UK, it should be happening everywhere. And one of the things we need to be arguing for much more around the world is for basic standards of living support. Now, many countries introduce this as a sort of disability pension and say, well, if you take the standard of living support, you're not allowed to work. That is contrary to the convention. This is for the extra cost of being a disabled person, which we estimate at 40 to 60% more than other people. And that's everywhere. So you need to have the extra money to live as well as having a job. And you need support to get a job, as Article 27 says. So most countries are doing very, very little. A 5% quota system in the public sector doesn't really address the issue. There needs to be strong enforceable legislation, which if people are not employed or do not get the support they need, then those people are taken to court. So we need to move forward. So coming back to answer your question, I don't think it was very much better. Certainly, we had to fight very hard to remove, for instance, do not resuscitate notices that were put on people in care, collective care and hospital and institutional settings, i.e. if they got COVID, don't bother to resuscitate them, let them die. I talked about the eugenicist view, and this is still very strong on the conservative right in the UK. Boris Johnson and his supporters often talk about this. So it is not right to think that everything's right for disabled people in the UK. We have lost many of our organisations because the government refuses to fund us. If they don't agree with us, they don't go to the democratically elected organisations of disabled people. They set up individuals who they say speak for disabled people. Well, that isn't it. We have to have our own independent democratic organisations, and 4.3 and Article 33.3 of the Convention require the government to fund and support us to do that, because otherwise how are they going to get the views of disabled people? They didn't get the views of disabled people in the UK. They made a lot of mistakes. After a huge amount of pressure from us, they got it slightly better. But the fact remains that because of the austerity cuts, which have not been reversed and have actually been continued, even in the last budget, the reality is that the lives of disabled people are much worse. Now, we're in a rich country, 5th richest in the world, and therefore one would expect the standard of living to be higher. But nevertheless, we are not gaining, we are moving backwards. And that's one of the things that we would have to say. And if you like, what happened to us during COVID was a wake-up call to many disabled people who think, well, we've had the legislation, we've got the Equality Act, we had before that the Disability Discrimination Act, we've got equal treatment now. Well, to get equal treatment, you yourself as an individual have to take the state, the government, the employer to law. What we're campaigning now for is that as it is government law, they should have an agency of inspectors, such as they do have on health and safety legislation, who will enforce the equalities legislation, and employers will be fined heavily if they don't do it. So we have to move a long way further to get full implementation, whether there's a COVID crisis or not. What COVID showed up in the UK and around the world was that the cracks are very great, and fine words butter no parsnips, as we say in England, and fine words don't do it. We need action, we need legislation, We need the media on our side rather than seeing us as amazing people if we do anything, actually seeing us from a human rights perspective. And we need to get everyone to do that. And I commend your campaign with disabled and non-disabled children as a way of changing that. And that we need those sorts of campaigns everywhere. Thank you.
Hi, I have received a few questions from people in the audience for our panelists.
Hope we can extend a few more minutes if that is all right by all the panelists.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Thank you very much. Please go, Duty.
Yeah.
Hita, just take 3 or 4 questions, then we will stop.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
So one of the questions that I have received is that this is for Dr. Komal Kamra. If you could give some statistics or percentages of spinal cord injuries in India that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in respect to people with disabilities.
I beg to state that we don't have, even without COVID-19, we do not know exactly the number of persons with spinal cord injuries who exist in India. COVID-19 brought out to us the statistics that I showed you. People from remote villages, people from all parts of the country who came out because we reached out to them. So that's how we were able to touch them through Touch Freedom campaign. But I don't know how many, the question says how many people got spinal cord injuries or were identified during this 1.5 years. I don't have that clarity with the question.
Ma'am, it just mentions during the COVID-19 pandemic, how many were, I'm guessing like the person who's asking means identified during.
Yeah, so the Spinal Foundation and its member organizations could recognize about 80 plus people and we take them across rehabilitation and that's it. But as Suji has mentioned, we lost lives. We did.
Yeah.
No matter how we reached out, we lost a wonderful person, Mr. S. Vaidyanathan, who brought TSF to where it is right now. I mean, it was, I think he was probably the best managed person with spinal cord injury. And for him to go away was a failure of the system in some ways. So that's all that I can talk about. I don't have the statistics, yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamra. The other question was for Mr. Emil Gauss. This was sent in by a mother who's saying that she has an autistic child at home. And what is happening is that during the lockdown, they are becoming very edgy and moody, sitting at home all day long, and therefore are becoming very difficult to handle. And she wants to ask if there is any way or any ideas about how to control those kinds of behavior.
Thank you for the question. And I need to put on my education as well as my self-advocate hat over here. When you look specifically at the autism spectrum, when you look specifically at the diagnosis, when there's a disruption in routine, it affects the emotional as well as the behavioral components of the individual on the autism spectrum, and especially referring to a child. And depending on the age, it also affects the family as well, because there will be meltdowns that will occur frequently. I think the best methods that referring to the experiences here in South Africa, what we've done, especially when the routines were disrupted in terms of the nationwide lockdown, parents made use of alternative ways in order to accommodate their child in difficult circumstances. Some of the examples that I mentioned in the presentation was referring to the the restriction of park walks or the restriction of movement. So what actually happened was parents find alternative ways to accommodate their child by having walks within the house, or basically if you stay in a complex area, or if you stay in an area where there's a garden, walk around the garden. So I think it is a very difficult question to answer because children are different, referring to the diagnosis. But also, I think in terms of that, a parent needs to find alternative ways to accommodate their child according to their interest as well. So I think that's the only way that I can answer that one.
Thank you so much. Thank
Can
you.
I just add a little bit? I think
Yeah,
it's really
definitely.
important for parents to have faith in their own understanding of their child and to see what are the things that stimulate them, but not too much, and to create a sensory environment which expands the experience of the child while keeping them within the boundaries of their own safety, so that if they have a yard or a garden or a place, you could actually set up a situation where you talk about it beforehand with the child, that maybe you make a simple plan of what you're going to do, and then you do it so what's happening is expected. And so you can broaden their horizons within the framework of what they are happy to do. So the worst thing you can do is just to leave the child with no stimulation. One needs to regularly stimulate for children in the neurodiverse spectrum. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions?
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening to all. I am an inclusive education teacher. I want to know from any speaker how the hearing impairment students participated in digital education.
Can you repeat the question?
So she would like to know how a child or a person with hearing impairment could benefit from a digital learning or a digital communication.
Anyone want to take that? I've got a few points if people want. There is research going on now to develop IT support for hearing impaired people, and I think within a few years we're going to see quite a big transformation in that. It will require access to IT equipment, which is costly, so there need to be grants set up for that equipment to be given. There needs to be electrification of rural villages so people can access that, and that electrification should be reliant on natural sources such as solar and wind, etc., water power, and micro schemes for each village is quite possible to do that, which then part of what we need to be saying is providing the assistive devices for people who need this. I'm talking about in low-income countries. But there also needs to be in the education establishments and the universities a willingness to experiment and to work with the equipment we've got. For instance, deaf people have enormously benefited by iPhones because they can now sign to each other on the iPhone. They can receive instructions through it and so on. So it's really quite important that sign language is taught to all hearing impaired and deaf children. I know there's quite a big push for things like cochlear implants and so on, but the deaf children who've gone through that, we'd had a survey in the UK for the first 1,000 who had used cochlear implants, which was very popular with their parents because they say it minimizes the impact of the impairment. In fact, it doesn't, because what happens if you go swimming or you're on the beach with your friends or on a lake or something else? You can't be wearing it then, and you suddenly, if you have no other means of communication, you're cut off completely. So we need to be insisting that our national sign languages are taught to all hearing impaired students, alongside of any devices that they may or may not use. The other thing that deaf students who use these devices say, they have to concentrate all the time. It's enormous strain to actually use them. And to be able to revert back to basic sign language is a huge relief. So let's not just throw out the fundamental forms of communication because there are alternatives around, because they are not as good. And although there are many oralists who still argue this, it has been deaf people and their communities who've said, no, we need sign and we need to keep sign. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. And I would also like to mention that there is an initiative in India where a disabled-friendly group are trying to develop an app where whatever communication, whatever text they are typing, it will come into, it will get translated into sign language version. So that is on trial, and also our Indian Sign Language Research Institute have come up with a dictionary which is also available on the internet with sign language interpreters, giving the interpretation for different words, statements, etc. And of course, with the Zoom call and any online call education system, we can have our sign language interpreter in one of the screen, like we are having it here, and that is how most of the classes are happening right now. With this, are we having any more questions, or can we wrap up? Duty?
I haven't received any other questions.
Who has raised his hand? Mr.
Okay.
Prasanna, our panelist Prasanna Kurupu has raised.
Yes, please, Mr. Kurupu.
Yeah, thank you again. I just want to add to the conversation about the sign language. And in Sri Lanka, most of the deaf people are extensively using the video conferencing for their communications. And also, one of the hearing impaired person has developed an application. It's called Sangwada, where it's useful for deaf people as well as for the others, because it has the possibility of transferring a term into sign language and also sign language into term. So it's it's kind of a pilot project. Right now they're using it, Sangwada. So likewise, you can use a lot of digital innovations to facilitate the communication. But as Richard mentioned, the sign language is the fundamental tool for communication. So we have to think about that as well.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Kurupu. So we have come to the end of this discussion, and it was really enriching discussion, and we came to know about the different challenges faced by people with disabilities across the globe. And as Dr. Komal and Emile said, there are different kinds of barriers faced by different people, persons with different disabilities. And yes, we saw the challenges, the gaps in the system, as mentioned by Richard, and he mentioned that this pandemic is a wake-up call. And Shruti also mentioned about building back better, and how do we build back better together, all stakeholders together. While we can also take examples from different panelists who gave different suggestions or their experiences of advocating with their governments, like Mr. Kurupu also mentioned about their media center and different things. So let us hope for the best. Let us work towards collectively towards building back better, and that is the only way, because building back better cannot happen if we don't build back collectively together. With this message, I would like to thank all the panelists once again, and handing it over to Didi. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, like Ms. Smita said, that I would like to thank all the speakers for their valuable insights. It was such a brilliant discussion. And I would also like to thank Mr. Raja Mishra for initially presenting to us so clearly what having dialogues in disability actually means. I would also like to thank our moderator, Ms. Smita Shadasirvan, for carrying out this dialogic conversation so efficiently. Of course, the panelists were I learned so much today, like Mr. Richard Reiser's talk on the condition of people with disability during the pandemic and government action was very interesting. Dr. Komal Kamra and her focus on spinal cord injured people with respect to the pandemic was something that I was personally very intrigued with. Mr. Prasanna Kurupu's addressal of situations of humanitarian emergencies was superbly interesting, as were the case studies from Sri Lanka. Mr. Emaiku's talk on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on autistic people was again very intriguing. Dr. Shruti Mohapatra talked about the repercussions of the pandemic on people with disabilities vis-a-vis the UN and Indian government reports, which was something that got me thinking as well. I would also like to thank the audience members for their huge participation. And I would also like to thank our sponsors who made this discussion possible, including the Odisha State Government, the Odisha Mining Corporation Limited, Indian Metals Public Charitable Trust, Bharat Petroleum, Team AdMark Private Limited, Frozit, Google for Nonprofits, and NASCOM Big Tech Foundation. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to Dr. Shruti Mohapatra and the entire Swabhiman team for putting together this panel discussion. My special thanks to all the correspondents and media partners who are bringing visibility to this program. All our sincere thanks and gratitude. With that, we reach to the end of this program. I hope to see a lot of you in our next events that are lined up for tomorrow and days after. Thank you and wish you all health and safety.
May I say thank you to Lanka as well, please?